children, the role that these play in children's reading development and in children's reading achievement. And then we'll get to the conclusion slide. And just as Barbara mentioned, if you're interested in the things that I'm talking about, there'll be a more full treatment of these on October 7th, also with the seminarian. So let's move on. This is just a little background, which Barbara already went over, but I've spent close to 40 years working with children, researching how their reading develops, and just continuing to be in awe of what a great accomplishment reading is. This is my most recent book. It was published this year, and most of what follows is closely related to this book, right? Now, I come to research and teaching of reading from the United States, where currently there is an enormous pressure to have teachers pay attention to the science of reading. And I think that's always a good idea. It's always good to have theories and research and science behind what we would hope to teach children. But in the United States, the science of reading is currently very narrow in its conceptualization, meaning when we look at the science of reading, what it encourages us to do is to teach the cognitive strategies and skills that students need to succeed in reading. And if we're good at doing this instruction, then what we get at the end should be students who have developed their reading skills and strategies and who are able to understand the text that they read. Now, I mentioned this already, but I believe that the science of reading is too constrained, it's too narrow. And I like to think about not teaching reading, but teaching readers, which lets us focus on individual students, how they are like, but also how they differ. And when we think about individual students, it's important, of course, to think about strategies and skills, but it's also important to think about students' metacognition and their motivation, their engagement, and their self-efficacy. And we know how important these are because there happens to be a very wide research base from the sciences of reading that tells us if we're successful in our instruction, that we can expect to have strategic and skillful readers. We also will have readers who are independent, who are motivated, and who believe in themselves. They believe that they can succeed when they begin to read, and they will learn from text. And so one of the things that I think is very important for us to ask as teachers are these questions: how can our teaching have a positive impact on our students' motivation? And how can our teaching positively impact our students' engagement? How can it impact their self-efficacy? And how can it impact their metacognition? So we'll explore that in just a bit. And so as we think about these very powerful factors, motivation, metacognition, self-efficacy, what I hope we can do is think about how they complement our skill and strategy instruction so that students both develop and achieve to their potential. And now I mentioned 5 minutes ago that I was going to ask you to do a simple task. And here's the simple task. It's a paragraph. And what I'd like you to do is read the paragraph. And while you're reading it and trying to understand it, I'd like you to do one other thing, which is try to keep track of what you are doing as an adult accomplished reader. And that might mean that you focus on strategies and skills, or that you focus on motivation or self-efficacy or metacognition. And when we're done with this little task, I want to show you how much all accomplished readers have in common. And then related, the task that young students have to move towards being an efficient and accomplished adult reader, right? So here's the paragraph. And if you could start reading it now to yourself, and remember to think about, yes.
Peter, no estamos viendo tu presentación. ¿Estás presentando?
Oh, you're not? Yeah, let's see. Did that work?
Perfecto. Voy a dar un mensaje al público, a los asistentes que están hoy en día. Peter va a proyectar su presentación en inglés. Sin embargo, nosotros por el chat le estamos enviando en este minuto la misma presentación en español, de tal manera que ustedes puedan ir viendo exactamente la misma presentación traducida al español. Evidentemente, Peter habla inglés, entonces para él es más cómodo poder hacer la presentación en su idioma. Así que, pero la presentación va a quedar para que todos y cada uno de ustedes puedan tener acceso también. Así que muchas gracias, Peter. Seguimos.
Sure. The question for our wonderful translator, were you able to translate my directions for reading this paragraph? Okay, thank you. Thank you. Okay, if you want to take 30 more seconds, because I know that this is a difficult paragraph, but I think that we'll learn some lessons from the reading here. All right, first, I'd like to thank Barbara for prompting me to share my screen. Okay, so thank you. And now what I'd like to do is...
Sí, no, gracias a ti, Peter. Estamos teniendo un poco un pequeño problema para que las personas puedan descargar la presentación, que lo vamos a resolver ahora. Le vamos a mandar un link de Drive para poder alojarlo.
Okay.
Que ya lo mandaron, así que ya nos avisan por el chat si ya tienen acceso a la presentación.
You know, I could let me. I can load that, I believe. Let's see.
Si nos pueden comentar por el chat si es que ya funciona la presentación. Tuvimos un pequeño problemas técnicos ahí. Perfecto, súper. Ya tenemos la presentación de Peter en español, la versión en español en el chat, para que puedan estudiarla y seguir la presentación en Peter en español. Así que estamos ya solucionados, Peter, para que podamos continuar.
Let's see. Is that better? That's the...
No estamos viendo. Creo que dejaste de compartir tu pantalla.
Okay. Okay, so I should stick with the English version.
Sí. Sí.
Okay, great.
No estamos viendo tu pantalla, Peter. Súper.
All right,
¿Puedes darle full screen? Modo presentación, tal vez.
Yes, yeah. Okay.
Perfect.
Yeah, so what I want to do now is, if you can think on what you experienced as you read this very challenging paragraph, I think you'll find a very close relationship to what other accomplished adults have read. And the next few slides contain information about what other readers reading this paragraph have come up with, right? So and it turns out this part of the research that I've done on reading is I use paragraphs like this that are very difficult, and I ask people to think aloud, to talk into a tape recorder or a portable phone, recording their strategies and their thoughts. And this is what happens. And I hope that you all can see yourselves in this sampling of the strategies that expert readers use. Many people scan and skim the text to size up the task at hand. Some people note that the text must be from the discipline of anthropology or archaeology. Some readers try to access relevant prior knowledge, if such knowledge is available. We all try to make inferences based on what the words we read, and we try to assign importance to different words and phrases, although that becomes difficult when we don't know much about the content of the paragraph. Expert readers also report focusing on vocabulary. In this case, the words horizon and broad point. They try to visualize text contents. They use context to determine word meaning. They try to break the text into shorter and more manageable segments or chunks of text, and then they paraphrase and translate the sections of text into more familiar terms. So those are the cognitive strategies and skills that people typically report when trying to read this very difficult paragraph. But it turns out that these strategies and skills are not the only thing that matter when we think about an accomplished adult reader and when we think about an accomplished student reader. And here's what else happens reading this paragraph, that most of us have very high initial motivation because of the challenging nature of the reading and because we have confidence in ourselves as readers. This initial high engagement with the task is then followed by diminished engagement. And sometimes readers get frustrated with the inability to understand this text. And that leads to diminished motivation as our effort and trying strategies does not seem to work. And there's this connection between motivation and our self-efficacy, because when we can't critically evaluate the text or figure out whether or not the author is being truthful, it's very frustrating for most readers. And we're also not comfortable because we're not able to determine if the information in the text is accurate or reliable. And I hope these ideas and your experience reading this difficult paragraph help illustrate how motivation and self-efficacy are intertwined as students read. So what's learned from this paragraph and our reading of this paragraph? Well, it's pretty clear that expert readers have a core of powerful reading comprehension strategies, and that our prior knowledge and our experience related to the content of the text is necessary for us to construct meaning. We also learned that motivation is central to reading success, and that strategic reading is accompanied and by and influenced by important phenomena of metacognition and self-efficacy. And it turns out motivation and engagement, metacognition, and self-efficacy are representatives of the very broad science of reading. And I would argue very strongly that they must be a focus in our classroom. And on top of this, given that we're all adults in this talk and all of you are accomplished readers, I'd like you to just step back and consider the challenges that your students may face when they read. Some of our students are challenged by texts that are far simpler than the text that you just tried to read. And these students face reading challenges every day. And it's important that we address all of their needs to help these students develop and achieve as readers. And again, this distinction is very important. If we continue to focus only on the cognitive strategies and skills of reading, then we will continue to teach reading. But in contrast, if we incorporate instruction and classroom experiences that are focused on metacognition, motivation, engagement, and self-efficacy, our instruction will evolve to teach readers. And when we teach readers, we are aware of and we can teach to students' individual differences. And this is just, here's an illustration of broad points, which may help you retrospectively understand the paragraph that you read. Now, the next group of slides, I want to give you just a little bit of background on motivation and engagement and self-efficacy and metacognition and the research that stands behind them to, I think, justify the argument that we need to pay attention to them in the classroom. So here's what some researchers say about motivation and engagement: that reading engagement is the joint functioning of motivation processes and cognitive strategies during reading. So when we think about maybe a mathematical equation that motivation plus strategies equals engagement, I think that's a good way to think about how do we get our students focused and enthusiastic about reading. And then Alexander, another researcher, says that reading competence can be achieved through development of knowledge of reading and text processing skills and strategies, and a personal commitment and motivation. So the research is fairly clear about the central role that motivation can play for student readers. And here are two other observations of the power of motivation. And this comes from PISA, which is the Program for International Student Assessment, in where students from Chile and the United States and all over the globe are assessed. PISA says engagement in reading can be a consequence as well as a cause of higher reading skill, but the evidence suggests that these two factors are mutually reinforcing. And the idea here is that when you get better at your reading skills, you naturally become more engaged. And when you become more engaged, you give yourself more time to practice strategies and skills. And I think this next quote is so important because in any country where there are economic divides and socioeconomic disadvantage, this matters. And this is Jim Cummins, who said, the negative effects of socioeconomic disadvantage can be pushed back in schools and classrooms where students have access to a rich print environment and become actively engaged with literacy. So something that we can strive for in our schools where there are economically disadvantaged students is to try to build up the motivation and engagement. We know through research that engaged readers are motivated to choose to read for a variety of purposes. These readers persevere when reading is challenging. These readers elect a wide range of literacy activities for aesthetic enjoyment, knowledge gain, and to interact with others. And we know that motivated students read for their own motivations, and these in turn activate the self-regulation of higher order reading strategies. So again, motivation is a very powerful operator in reading. Now, general guidelines for responsive teaching with motivation engagement is that we help students set appealing and realistic learning goals, as well as goals for performance that are appropriately challenging, that we involve students in learning experiences that they value, and that we support students' sense of control and autonomy. So that's just a glimpse of what I'll be talking about on October 7th, where we'll go in much more detail into teaching strategies for motivation and engagement. So we say October 7th to be continued, how we best teach for motivation and engagement. The second of these three sciences that I'd like to look at would be metacognition. And metacognition is really our ability to attend to and keep track of our reading and to become independent and successful on our own. Some terms or words that are associated with metacognition include self-awareness, executive function, comprehension monitoring, mindfulness. And basically it's our students' growing ability to understand the connections between many factors and mindsets that influence their reading competency. Here's what research says about metacognition. Metacognition is knowledge about cognition. It's an awareness of one's own thinking processes. It's comprehension of requirements for learning. It's control of learning processes. And it's regulation of cognitive procedures. It's the mindful regulation of one's own learning processes. That's the heart of metacognition. We know from research that metacognition has a positive influence on reading comprehension. And we know that metacognitive students understand the relationship between their efforts and reading outcomes. And this, in turn, contributes to students' increased motivation and engagement. And again, just a coming attraction or a glimpse at the teaching that we'll focus on October 7th. Wienman and his colleagues draw 3 general goals for teaching readers in relation to metacognition. And that is that we need to use explicit teaching that focuses on the value of metacognition. Second, we need to situate metacognitive instruction in authentic learning contexts. And finally, we need to provide continual teaching of metacognitive mindsets and strategies. Again, October 7th, we'll go more in depth into how we best teach for students metacognition. And now the third of the 3 sciences is what we call self-efficacy. And Albert Bandura, who is pretty much considered the grandfather of self-efficacy, wrote this paragraph, which I think is so powerful and so important. Among the mechanisms of human agency, none is more central or pervasive than belief of personal efficacy. Unless people believe they can produce desired effects by their actions, they have little incentive to act or to persevere in the face of difficulties. Now, this print, which I've put in italics and yellow, is just such a powerful statement. And I think if you look at that sentence and think about students you know who struggle, I think this helps describe part of their struggle. If these students don't believe that they can succeed at reading, they have little or no incentive to try to read. And they have little or no incentive to give effort and to persevere when they meet reading difficulties. We know from research the following things: that when students have low self-efficacy, they have a diminished motivation to read. They have lower self-regulation or lower metacognition, and they avoid tasks. Now, we see this a lot in the United States. The students who struggle most, of course, try to avoid being a failure in reading. That's a fairly natural thing for a human being, to try to avoid tasks where one fails continually. We don't want that to happen, so part of what we must do is to help students increase their self-efficacy. Teachers who are helping students build self-efficacy do the following things. We provide students with mastery experiences that allow them to succeed. In the United States, we have a saying, it's nothing succeeds like success. And when it comes to self-efficacy, nothing will help the struggling student reader more than having a series of success experiences. Now, these can be very small, step-by-step little successes. Nevertheless, these are successes, and they help build a foundation for self-efficacy. We also should be giving directive and supportive feedback.
Genial.
Yes? So giving supportive and directive feedback is very important also here. And we will, again, on October 7th, go more into teaching to help students develop self-efficacy. So we can say in summary that the fields of motivation, motivation engagement, metacognition, and self-efficacy they're well-researched. They are members of the broad sciences of reading. They impact students' reading development, and they impact students' reading achievement. And they are all deserving of our attention when we teach. Now, one of the things that I think is very fascinating about each of these very powerful contributors to students' reading development is how they interact. And when we get back together in October, we'll be able to talk about how does motivation and engagement influence strategy and skill development? How does metacognition influence strategy and skill development? How does self-efficacy influence reading strategy and skill development? But we'll also talk about how does metacognition influence self-efficacy? And how does motivation and engagement influence self-efficacy? And it turns out that when all of these gain our attention in the classroom, they have a very powerful effect together to help students become better readers. That's another thing that I'm very excited about sharing on October 7th. So when we look into our classrooms, I like to see a balance in classrooms when I work with my student teachers at the University of Maryland. And these are 8 of the things that I have on a checklist. I'd like to see our young students developing word recognition. I want to see their fluency develop. I want to see their vocabulary grow. And I want to see their comprehension increasing year to year. But I also want to see a teacher's attention given to motivation and engagement, to self-efficacy, metacognition, and then the causes to which students attribute their performances. And it doesn't have to be that these are separated in 2 columns. It's that all of these are very interactive. And when our classroom is structured well, and when the learning environment is reflecting that structure, we can expect optimal development for our students. So here we go with the conclusions. I would argue strongly that we must teach readers focused on all of the aspects of development and avoid teaching only reading, meaning we have to avoid thinking that if we only give strategy and skill instruction, that's all that our students need. We know that they need more than that. When we teach readers, it allows us to draw from the broad sciences of reading, moving beyond strategy and skill to focus also on metacognition, motivation and engagement, self-efficacy, and other influential factors. And when we teach readers, it leads us to know and then allows us to teach to students' individual differences. And we know that while cognitive skill and strategy are required for reading development and success, they do not account for all that must be working for students to succeed. And this is a final conclusion slide. While my presentation focused on reading and teaching readers, the influences of motivation and engagement, metacognition, and self-efficacy are, of course, school-wide and lifelong, which means we must pay attention to motivation, engagement, metacognition, and self-efficacy because they're at the heart of students learning and becoming independent and becoming successful. And I would like to say gracias. And that is my email address. If anyone would like to email me in English, por favor, so that I could give you a written response.
Muchísimas gracias, Peter, por tu presentación. Estamos muy contentos y agradecidos de la tecnología también, de que a pesar de que estamos a muchos kilómetros de distancia, te pudimos sentir tan cerca aquí en Chile y en los demás países de Latinoamérica. Well, queremos invitarlos ahora a esta parte final de la presentación de Peter, a que puedan hacer sus preguntas a través del chat, o si quieren hacerlo con micrófono, si pueden levantar la mano y habilitaremos su audio para que puedan encender su micrófono y hablar directamente con Peter, contarles cómo son las situaciones en sus comunidades educativas, y estamos a la espera de sus preguntas. Pero mientras nos llegan las preguntas, queremos invitarlos a cada uno de ustedes a este 7 de octubre. Vamos a estar junto también con Peter en el seminario, en el tercer seminario internacional de innovación para el aprendizaje de la lectura. Este va a ser un seminario también internacional, donde va a estar Peter haciendo una presentación, no la misma que acabamos de ver. Esta es una introducción de lo que vamos a ver ese día en el seminario, y vamos a estar junto con Marianne Wolf. que nos va a estar acompañando también ese día. Seguimos esperando también sus preguntas, que las puedan hacer a través del chat y las traducimos también para ustedes, para alguna pregunta que le quieran hacer a Peter. Esperaremos un par de minutos.
¿Tiene
¿Sí?
que ser por el chat o podemos preguntarla?
Sí, puedes preguntarle así también.
¿Y en español?
Yes.
Sí, en español. El traductor va a traducir. Ya estamos aquí con Montserrat. Dale, Mons.
Sí. Hola, buenas tardes y gracias. Me gustaría saber qué opinas sobre las plataformas digitales que apoyan la lectura o que enseñan la lectura.
Well, I'm assuming that digital platforms in Chile are similar to the ones in the United States. I have seen them be valuable for helping students practice their skills and strategies. I especially my teaching of elementary school students was always with remedial readers. So they were the readers who struggle most. And I tried to have a classroom where I could individualize instruction and try to find time to work one-on-one with each student, which, as you know, is really difficult. So a digital platform that provides skill and strategy practice, I think, is potentially valuable. When I think when it's not valuable, it's when it gets overused and it becomes the default teaching strategy. Like we're working with a small group and everyone else is off on a digital platform. However, I also know that some of the newer digital platforms can really boost student motivation and engagement because they can, for example, prompt student writing that is very personalized around students' personal interests and the things that they're dealing with on a daily basis. So I think of digital as a wonderful counterpart to a live teacher, and a live enthusiastic teacher. Thank you for that question.
Muchísimas gracias, Peter, a ti por tu respuesta y a Montserrat también que nos hizo esta pregunta, que sin duda la tecnología no la podemos dejar de lado en la educación, y estas nuevas generaciones que son nativos digitales están inmersos también con tecnología. Así que muchísimas gracias, Peter, también por tu pregunta. ¿Hay alguna otra pregunta más dentro de la audiencia? Si no...
¿Yo puedo hacer una pregunta?
Claro que sí, adelante.
Ajá. Quisiera preguntarle sobre los niños que tienen dislexias y otros problemas de aprendizaje, si hay algo diferente a lo que él dijo que pueda hacerse o que pueda trabajarse.
Yeah, a concern that I have with dyslexia is that it gets used to describe students who are sometimes have very different etiologies to their reading challenge. I think the classic dyslexic is a student who might have hereditary challenges to reading development that range from auditory processing difficulties to that contribute to phonemic awareness difficulties. A concern of mine is that in the United States, I'm not sure if this is happening in Chile, is that anyone who's struggling to read in kindergarten or first grade might be labeled dyslexic, where actually they're just not at a level of development that some of their classmates, and these classmates are often economically privileged or educationally privileged. So they're advanced because they've had exposure to language that's more school-like, and they've had perhaps parents who have enrolled them in a nice preschool for something like that. But the dyslexia issue in the United States tends to revolve around making sure that students have mastered sound symbol correspondences. And to do that, of course, we need to develop phonemic awareness and then be very good at phonics, whether it's long and short vowels and consonant blends and things like that. unfortunately, in the United States, I believe there's an overfocus on students who are labeled dyslexic, which has led to every child in kindergarten, first grade, in some states being tested for dyslexia, whether or not they need to be tested. And in some schools and states, a lot of money being spent on programs to help dyslexic students when they're not all dyslexic. So it's not just a dyslexia issue. It's also an economic issue. It's also involves sort of the educational philosophy that I think each teacher should bring to the classroom, and how they see students. And I think because it's so important for us to be aware of how we conceptualize students, because I think that's where we do our best work. I see you as someone who's enthusiastic about sports, but I also see you as someone who struggles with reading. So is there a way that I can bring sports into any type of reading instruction, even if it's at the sound symbol level, so that you might become more engaged, more motivated, and eventually become a successful independent reader?
Muchísimas gracias, Peter,
Gracias.
por tu respuesta. Gracias también, María Teresa, por tu valiosa pregunta. Vamos a ir cerrando, Peter. Nos llegó nuestra última pregunta de Laura Bamondes y nos pregunta, Peter, desde lo que comentas en las conclusiones, ¿cómo consideras que es posible motivar a los estudiantes para que consideren la lectura como una herramienta de aprendizaje?
Well, I think for most human beings, learning by doing is a very powerful experience. And I love that question, because I think it's really focused on our most challenging students. And those are the ones who have maybe yet to learn the value of reading. And so as teachers, we're talking to these students and we're telling them, reading is so valuable, reading is so great. Reading is something you'll really need when you're older. But the student hasn't experienced the power and value of reading. And so I think the most creative and the most successful teachers are the ones who are able to meet a student at whatever level the student is, and help the student quickly understand how valuable reading can be. And yeah, in our reading clinics at the University of Maryland, we often work with struggling elementary school students who are not motivated at all. And what we try to do over 8 to 10 weeks is just get students comfortable with the idea that reading can be a rewarding pastime. And, I think a very simple and straightforward way to do that is to try to match reading material with the student's interests in life. And it could be about pets, it could be about ballet, it could be about climate change, it could be about llamas, it could be about horses. But every child has a passion, and finding that passion, and then finding books or texts or a website that is filled up with things that will grab the student's attention and create motivation are, to me, the straightforward paths to helping that student.
Muchísimas gracias, Peter. Espero, Laura, que haya respondido también tu pregunta. ¿Tenemos tiempo para una pregunta más, Peter? ¿Sí? Perfecto. Rosa Lisa nos pregunta, nos dice, muchas gracias por la presentación. ¿Podría compartir desde su experiencia cómo incentivar la autoeficacia en la tarea de lograr lectores exitosos?
Yes, yeah. When I think about self-efficacy, I think about all of us in this Zoom meeting. We're adults, and we have earned the privilege when we're adults of not participating in things that we are bad at. For example, I tried to play tennis and I was terrible at tennis, but I'm an adult and I can just say, I can't do this, I'm going to walk away from it. Our students who are not doing well in reading or math or history or science, they don't have the option and they don't have the luxury of just saying, I'm not good at it. I have to walk away. So where do we start? And I mentioned in one of my slides this idea that nothing succeeds like success. And when I work with struggling students, I realize that the success that they have is as rare as a drink of water in the desert. That it's very unusual for students who struggle at reading to experience success. And yet they come to school every day. They're asked to sit and they're asked to give effort in a way where in the past they haven't been rewarded for it. They haven't understood the text. They haven't received teachers' praise. So the idea that we build what at first are often very small steps for success for our students is really important. And in addition to a student learning to appreciate themselves and the effort that they give, something that's very important is directive teacher feedback, so that when we see a struggling reader succeed, it's always nice to say, great work, that's a great job, but we need to be specific in what we mean by great job. I really liked the fact that you saw that there was a mistake here and you went back and you reread and you corrected your mistake. And look, now you understood this little story that we've been reading. So that sort of directive teacher feedback gives kids a boost that helps them connect the effort that they gave and with their self-image. And I'll say it, our struggling students often have very poor self-images, and we need to help repair those self-images. And succeeding is the most direct path to helping struggling readers become better. And that's a little bit of an oxymoron, because we could ask, well, what do struggling readers succeed at? They don't succeed at anything. But that's where our creativity as teachers comes in. It's what can we do so that the student doesn't feel like we're treating them like an infant, but we're giving them a doable chunk of work that they can succeed at. So our ability to know where students are and ability to adjust our instruction so that there's the opportunity for success, even very small success, is a great starting point for any student with low self-efficacy.
Muchísimas gracias, Peter. Rosa, espero también que haya podido responder tu pregunta. Nos encantaría poder responder todas las preguntas que nos han llegado, sin embargo, tenemos un tiempo acotado hoy día y queremos sin duda poder responder sus preguntas. Vamos a estar este día 7 de octubre, en un par de semanas más, después de las fiestas patrias, nuevamente junto a Peter, hablándole a las comunidades de Chile y de Latinoamérica acerca de la importancia de la motivación de la lectura. Quiero agradecerte, Peter, en nombre de la Fundación Educacional Seminario y en nombre de los asistentes también, por esta rica presentación que hoy día nos pudiste dar. Sin duda es un tema que tenemos un debe en Latinoamérica. Tú eres consciente de los resultados de las pruebas PISA los últimos años, en Chile en particular, y estamos muy felices de que que hayamos podido tener este rico espacio de conversación y de enseñanza acerca de la lectura. Queremos dejarlos invitados a cada uno de ustedes a que estén atentos a las redes sociales, a los mails de Fundación Educacional Seminarium, para que estén atentos a las próximas novedades y eventos que nosotros vamos a tener y que estamos realizando constantemente para poder trabajar por la educación de Chile y Latinoamérica hoy. Así que sin más, quiero despedirlos a todos ustedes y a Peter. Hoy en día, Peter, quiero dejarte con el último minuto para que puedas hacer tus palabras finales hoy día para la audiencia de hoy.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you everyone who attended. I know that our teaching days are always so full. There's never enough time to do everything we want to. So I'm honored that you've carved out some time from your schedule. And again, if you want to email me in English, I will try to answer your questions. And I'll be back on October 7th and look forward to seeing you all then. And good luck, good fortune with teaching. And thank you for the teaching that you do.
Muchas gracias a ti, Peter.
Thank you.
Estamos hablando. Un abrazo para todos. Chao, chao.
Bye.